Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Byrnes, and today I'm excited to be interviewing the novelist Juliet Grames to discuss her best-selling historical fiction novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. This book came out in May 2019. I'm the author of the novel Royal Beauty Bright and the upcoming novel My Dear Antonio, and I'm on a mission to interview many authors as I can to see if I can learn anything from them. So I remember reading The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna on an airplane. I was 30,000 feet up, flying over the Midwest where I'm from. And when I was reading the book, I was struck by just how authentic it was, because it felt like I was stepping into my own family history since I'm Italian American. The book covers the story of an Italian American immigrant named Stella Fortuna, and it covers 7 or 8 times in her life when she almost didn't make it. So it's a privilege to talk with Juliet today. So thanks for coming, Juliet.
Oh, thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, and I'll introduce you real quick. So Juliet is the Senior Vice President and Associate Publisher at Soho Press. From what I understand, she specializes in crime fiction and translating crime fiction from foreign languages. She's been working there about 13 years and has built a prolific career. Some of her books that she's worked on have won the Mystery Writers of America Ellery Queen Award. As if all that wasn't enough, Juliet is not only a publisher, but she's also an author. Her debut novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, was published with HarperCollins in 2019, and the book is a national and international bestseller, and it was shortlisted for the New England Book Award and the Connecticut Book Award. So I hope I got all that right. So thanks, Juliet. It's a thrill to talk. So would you mind giving us a summary of the 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna and tell us how it came to be?
Sure. So the 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna is the story of Stella Fortuna, but really of her greater family. And Stella is a young woman who's born in the years after World War I in an impoverished mountain village in Italy, just like the town my grandmother immigrated from. And she is, born under an unlucky star. And throughout her life, she has 7 or 8 near-death experiences. The structure of the story follows almost 100 years of her life and is knit together with the story of her sister, Cettina, who is her best friend and later her worst enemy. So when you meet the sisters in their dotage, they're almost 100 years old, you know that they haven't spoken in 30 years and they've been locked in some kind of blood feud that neither of them can explain to their family. And the long arc of their story, which covers everything from their very impoverished youth, their father's emigration to the United States, leaving their mother abandoned in their mountain village, the difficult years between the wars, courtship, emigration, all of that family drama is unpacked in order to try to pick apart what drove these former best friends apart. So that's the novel. The inspiration was, in fact, the lives of my grandmother and her sister, who it's not just a novelization of their life stories. It is a novel. It's fictitious, but I drew a lot of inspiration from the things that they went through and their bravery, their senses of humor about what was very difficult and dangerous about being an immigrant woman in the 20th century. And it's an homage to, I think, just immigrants in general, but if you want to drill down specifically to immigrant women and the ways that they forge families and keep them together, even though in many cases they're coming from very difficult patriarchies where they don't have rights. They can't, like in the Italian South in the 1920s, women couldn't control money or property, and so they had to try to forge their way through these difficult circumstances with almost nothing. And I just think their stories are fascinating, their resourcefulness and the way they got through. So yeah, the book is an homage to them collectively and a love letter to a part of the world I think is vastly misunderstood. Ryan, I don't know where your family is from, but many of us Italian Americans are from the Italian South. That's where
Yeah.
our people left from, right? And we don't think of the South when we think of Italy. We think of Venice or Rome or Florence or great works of art, or and all that's fantastic. And we should be proud of that heritage, but we should also be proud of the heritage that our people were forced to leave, because the south of Italy, it's a rich place. It's been deeply troubled by colonialism, but the history and the art and the culture it's the backbone and the fabric of why our ancestors were as tough and smart and willing to sacrifice everything for us as they were. So yeah, so it's a love letter to Calabria as well.
Oh wow. That that I didn't know your family came from Calabria. My family came from Sicily, kind of in the Palermo area. So when I worked on my upcoming book, which is a dramatization of my great grandparents' lives, I learned a lot about southern Italy, how it used to be the kingdom of the two Sicilies, and then it was incorporated into Italy, and then the monarchy was abolished, feudalism was
Yeah.
abolished, and their social structure just kind of collapsed into poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah, they went through a lot of hard things. Yeah.
They did. It's funny you brought that up. The if you go to the Italian South and you talk to some local, evangelists about Southern culture, there is a theory that in fact when Italy unified, the South was so rich, the kingdom of the two Sicilies, it was so full of Bourbon gold, because the Bourbon monarchy had, they had colonies all over the world, and they were harvesting gold from all kinds of places, and they were just lousy with Spanish gold. And so some people say that the Italian North actually colonized the South in order to take the gold, and they left the South basically to collapse. As you said, they took away all their structure, and then they harvested also the youth, the labor of the youth, and moved them all to the northern cities. And there is this tragedy of the unification of Italy, and why all of our ancestors left at the same time. What happened there? This huge economic trauma that was forced on them. It's really, really interesting history.
Yeah, yeah. And readers, you can learn all about that in her book. So, yeah. So, one thing that struck me the most when I was reading this book was that it feels like a new take on the Italian immigration narrative. Is I think a lot of the time when our families tell us stories about immigration, there's a lot of nostalgia, and they're often romanticized. And there's the stereotype of how they say, "My father came to this country with 10 cents in his pocket and he built a great life for us." And it's aligned with the American dream.
Yeah.
And so when I talk to my Nana, she only tells me the good things about the story, which is
Yeah.
really interesting. But in your book, the main character, she has a very adversarial relationship with her family. A lot of times her family is the source of the trouble in her life. And yeah, I thought that was a very unique take that I hadn't seen in an immigration book. So what led you to tell that story? Yeah.
Thanks. Well, part of it was my goal. What you just said was my goal, was to tell this story because I found myself unsatisfied by a lot of the immigrant narratives that I would read when I was seeking them out. Um, which I always do. I can't look away. I have to read an immigrant narrative. So the thing is that life was really hard. And that story about, my grandfather came over with 10 cents in his pocket, etc. It's true. It's completely true. But the flip side of that we don't talk about in the nostalgia, is that his life was so hard. His life was marginalized. He was probably abused or taken advantage of. He may have been a victim of an organized criminal syndicate that, took his wages, or at least an exploiting boss. He probably didn't make a living wage. He may have worked an 18-hour day. All of those things. The immigrant lives a marginalized life. And to sugarcoat that experience and not talk about the difficulties of it it does a couple things. First of all, it makes us very out of touch with the immigrant experience today, which is much more like what it was for our grandparents, then we want to believe. And um, for me, I was hoping that this book would be a tool for people whose antecedents came over, 2 or 3 generations ago, who were proud of our immigrant antecedents to as a point of connection and a reminder that there are people struggling through this and even worse things right now in order to try to
Yeah.
keep their families together and save their own lives. That was really important to me. And the other thing is that specifically for women, for that marginalized grandfather who suffered all of those bad things in order to save his family or to make the money or to live out the American dream, he had a tough time, and he might have been a great guy. He might have been really strong, and he might have made it through that difficult time, never resorting to drink or never trying to gamble to get a little extra money, never losing his temper and entering into abusive relationships with his loved ones. Maybe he got through all of that and that never happened. Maybe he never did a bad thing in his life. Maybe somehow he returned home from war. He probably fought in war, because we have both the Great War and World War II kind of underpinning the and all the PTSD and soldier
Oh,
trauma, returning soldier trauma there. So, maybe he somehow dealt with his post-war trauma and didn't let that affect his personality either. But probably things were hard for him and he had bad days. And in a situation like there was in southern Italy where women were so disempowered, right? They had nothing. The one thing that a man, a very poor man, had control over was his family. He owned his wife and children. And the lack of parity in that family dynamic in the form of patriarchy, it meant for a lot of unhappiness, for systems, for power struggle, for abuse, for violence. All of these things that happen, these are the products of marginalization. When we make people unhappy and we force them to live in really unhappy ways, women suffer. Women and children suffer. And so I wanted to capture that experience. I wanted to look at how women suffered under these patriarchal stringencies. And there is, I'm not going to accuse all Italian Americans, but many Italian Americans have historically felt that we need to only project the nostalgia. We only say good things about our community. Otherwise, you're letting down the side. We it's our code of silence. It's our omerta, right? You only talk about the good things. You do not embarrass or denigrate anyone in the community. It's antithetical to our um, cultural cohesion. But if you can never talk realistically about that the bad things that a good man may have done, then it means you cannot talk about the things that his women suffered. And if you can't talk about the way women suffered, then you have the rippling of their trauma through generations. And this is where you see the pain today in grandchildren or great grandchildren who are never quite clear on where families started to fall apart or where these generational traumas originated. So I wanted to be honest. I wanted to scrutinize what happens in a marginalized community. I wanted to look at particularly the effect on women of enforced poverty and the stringencies of immigration and the immigrant lifestyle. So
yeah. Another angle that I wanted to get into was, I think it's very unique that you are also in the publishing industry. For the last 13 years, you've been senior vice president and associate publisher, crime fiction at Soho Press. I think this gives you a very unique perspective because you've seen both sides of the author-publisher relationship. So what do you think that working at Soho has taught you about writing that you wouldn't have normally learned otherwise?
well, being an editor has been my MFA. Um, I've always loved to write. I started writing when I was a little kid, like 5 or 6. I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I got into publishing because I didn't think writing was a realistic career path, and became an editor because I thought, oh, I can be close to books and helping other people with their books. So I've never studied writing, I've never taken a writing class, but I have had many other writers have privileged me, they've trusted me with their work and allowed me to help them talk about how to make their book the purest and most uh accessible to readers, the most direct connection, um, iteration of their vision. And it's taught me so much. It's taught me about, craft. It's taught me about originality and how it's taught me to be bold about personal choices in art and knowing when things need to be modified to reach a reader and when you should resist the desire or the urge to modify something to reach a reader and you should stay true to your own originality. It's taught me a lot of those things. And working with different writers and talking about their processes has taught me a lot about that too. So yeah, I think that I recommend to those who don't have 2 or 3 years to spend on an MFA. Instead, you should spend about 20 years in publishing and it will get you to the same place. But no, I love my job. I love working with books, and it's really it has helped me see so many different ways of storytelling.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah. So another thing that I was really interested to learn about is since this book is based on your own heritage as a descendant of Italian American immigrants, you said that your family came from Calabria. I wanted to learn what kind of if you've been to Calabria or what kind of research you've done, if you spent a lot of sessions talking to your older family members to hear their story and what that was like. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I did. So I conducted more than 100 interviews for this book. They were of varying length, and certainly some I derived more from than others. I mean, my one of my great aunts in particular, I think the taped interviews with her alone, I had over 30 hours. So
Wow.
and a lot of them were much more casual. I talked to everyone I could. Um, but yes, I did actually started writing this book at the point when they arrive in America because I was able, I researched it for many years. I read, I started these interviews in the States, but I had never been to Italy and I just didn't
Yeah.
feel comfortable. I kept trying to start at the beginning and I didn't feel like I had the authority to write about that. And so instead, I started at the part when they arrive in America. I drew from the interviews and from people I knew and from places I was able to visit. And I really like details. I like specificity and authenticity of detail. So for me, it just really helps to have been able to see something. Um, to be able to recreate it in my mind's eye. I'm not a person who can just run away with my imagination. I really need to feel locked, grounded in reality. And I just didn't have that for Italy at all. And so for a long time I maundered about this because I was like, how are you going to fix it? You could go to Italy, you could take a leave of absence from your job and go to this town where your grandmother was born, but that was still 100 years ago. So you can't
Yeah.
go back in time, Is it going to help that much? You're going to have to make stuff up no matter what you do. So, but I did it. I think I had really cold feet. I was nervous. I was nervous about not being able to pull it off.
Yeah.
But I did eventually, and I got a dispensation to take. I left my job for a month, and I went to the tiny village she was born in, and
Wow.
I lived with total strangers who lived in the house she had grown up in, which is still standing, and they are. They're obviously they're related to me because it's a tiny village and there's only 200 people. So it's
Wow.
my second cousin and his wife, and they treated me like one of their children. They had two sons who were a couple years older than me at the time, and they were very, very generous, and they drove me around and introduced me to people. And over a month of being there, it really clicked, and I felt like inhabited by that spirit of the place. And maybe somewhere else in the world, if you tried to go and imagine what it was like 100 years ago, it would be harder. But in Yevoli, which is the name of the village, a lot of things are the same as they were 100 years ago. So the streets are so steep, like 45-degree angle that you up the middle strip, and people still go to church. Some people go every day, but everyone goes once a week, and there's still the same one shop at the bottom piazza where you get your coffee if you are buying a coffee, if you have the money for coffee 100 years ago, but now it's like where you can get an ice cream. And I don't know, so much of it felt people still have a pig that they raise and slaughter in January. I got to witness the pig slaughter. They still cure sausage the way they did then. And these were all details where, plus, I got to talk to every single person in that village. And some of them in their 90s remembered my great grandmother.
Wow.
They remembered, those moments in the 20s when people were, this was now in 2015, so it was, or 2014, so it was a while ago, but um,
Wow.
yes,
That's
it
so
was
cool.
neat. It was a very lucky experience for me. And that was my first time. And I've had the privilege to go back now several times. So
Wow. I bet they all know you there now.
yeah, yeah,
Was it
they do. They're up once you show yourself, they're all up in your business.
wasn't the book I think I remember reading that there was some kind of award in Italy or some kind of
Yeah.
translation in Italian for your
Yeah,
book?
yeah, I did. That was my most recent trip to Calabria was in May of last year because it won the Premio Cittadino, which is for it's awarded by the University of Calabria, the town of Cittadino. They have and it's for Southern Italian literature, which is neat. And it was awarded to the Italian translation. So to be recognized as an Italian writer was I really, I mean, like heartbreakingly cool. But there's not a ton of literature that is allowed to be published about the Italian South because there's a lot of, that taboo around it. So
Yeah.
it was cool.
Wow. That's so cool. I related to that a lot because I have family that's still in a little town next to Palermo, and I thought that was my favorite part of the book because the way you were describing Calabria, it was very idyllic, and I remember you were talking about how the all of the towns were strung along the ridge like beads on a necklace. I remember that line, but
Yeah.
yeah, that was my favorite part of the book, just because it was idyllic. And you brought up an interesting point about how to write a story about a place you've never been to.
Mm.
Um, and I guess I wanted to hear your take on this because I tried to come up with some kind of solution to that, and it, I found it was helpful to write from the point of view of a character who was not from there. So
Yeah.
if it's a character who's not Italian and doesn't know anything about Italy, and then they go to Italy, it might be a little easier to write from their point of view. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, to talk about craft and voice, that's such an interesting point. And it was probably one of my struggles, the hardest thing to do in this book, because research, you could do it eventually. And I was lucky about this Italian trip. I got a leave of absence from my boss. I was able to stay for free. So I had all these lucky breaks that allowed me to do that. But um, so eventually maybe I would have gotten there. But creating the character of Stella to have her be an authentically Italian person.
true. Yeah,
And it was really painstaking work. It was hard. And um, I think that's where the interviews were so helpful. And the reason I wrote her in the third person and allowed a first person narrator to comment, long arm comment from time to time, because to write an authentic woman of that generation, there would be there are things that happen to Stella that make me really angry that
oh
would
yeah,
not have made her angry
that's
because
true. Yeah,
she would not have been allowed to think that that wasn't what she should have expected.
yeah. She
And
thought it was normal. Yeah,
right, or that there was no other choice, that this is just what happens to women. And so I cheated there. I didn't try to write Stella in the first person. I only ever tried to write her in the third person. But then I also gave myself that leeway of a first person narrator who could comment. when the historical element became, intolerable. But I agree with you. For my second novel, it's another historical set in Calabria. It's set in 1960. And in that case, I really wanted to write a first person narrator, but I didn't feel like I was up to the task of writing an Italian woman first person.
Yeah, that's
So
hard. Yeah.
so she's American. So she's going to be an American living in Calabria. So
Okay. Oh, nice. Yeah. Well, I feel like that suits your experience traveling there.
yeah,
Yeah. When does do you have a estimated date for your second book?
I do. It's coming out on July 23rd, 2024. So
Okay, cool.
7 months. Yeah.
Perfect summer beach read.
I hope so. I hope so.
For all the people who are taking vacations there. Yeah. Do you have a copy of the book with you by
Of
chance?
Stella,
Yeah.
I do.
Ooh,
Which copy
okay.
would you like to see?
Um, your favorite one.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. But this is
okay.
the hardcover.
Oh yeah.
This is the one you're going to see around most often. This is
That's the
what
one I read. Yeah.
yeah, the
Yeah.
paperback and the ebook look like this. So,
Oh,
um, now, this one is very near and dear to me because it's so shiny. This was the British hardcover. How beautiful is this? They actually, the
ah,
art that they commissioned, it has all of the herbal plants that are mentioned growing in Yavoli. So they did
wow.
this really thoughtful, gorgeous package. Their paperback looks like our paperback, so that's the same.
Wow.
And
That's pretty
finally,
elaborate.
I want to shout out to Lithuania because I love that a Lithuanian publisher that this story about Italian American immigration appealed to them, and they took the trouble to translate it for their tiny reading public of only 2.4 million or whatever it is people.
Do you have a passage that you would like to read to close out the interview? Is there a section of the book that um, you're the most interested in? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm going to read to you a passage from sort of a quarter in. Stella's father is named Antonio Fortuna, and he emigrates to the United States in advance of his family. And eventually he brings them to the United States, but this isn't the part of the book that's about him. When Antonio Fortuna came home after 4 years in the army in World War I, Yevoli was too small for him. He sailed to the United States for the first time in February 1920, following in the footsteps of 4 million other Italian immigrants. Most of them came from the South, Sicily, Campania, Puglia, and Basilicata, as well as Calabria, where Italian unification had hurt the most, where war and taxes had squeezed the already impoverished contadini dry. The South was emptied of adult men. In Calabria, 30% of households had no capo, no male head. Italian men emigrated because they wanted to work, to make better lives for themselves than the poverty and exploitation they had left, although there was plenty of poverty and exploitation in La America too. Italian laborers, almost always men, often illiterate and with no recourse to aid or advice, crossed the ocean in steerage to be herded onto trains bound for coal mines in West Virginia or for jobs laying railroad tracks in the forests of Pennsylvania. They left unpaved, unplumbed, deforested, and malarial villages. They left starvation, cholera, entrenched feudalism, an inescapable class system. They left their families in hopes of reuniting with them under better auspices. They brought their love of food and orderly gardens, their languages and their prejudices, their mysterious triple god and their myriad saints, their rites and their songs and their pageants. They brought their worship of their mothers. They brought their mothers. In many cases, they intended to go back, which made our Italian ancestors unusual among would-be American immigrants. But in many cases, they never did go back, which made us the same as everyone else.
Wow. That's great. Thanks so much. I feel like there are so many topics that I wanted to discuss that we couldn't fit into the time for this interview. So I hope we can continue when your second book comes out, because I'm looking forward
I'd
to
love
reading
to.
that. So yeah,
I'd
yeah,
love to. Thank you so much for this invitation and the thoughtful questions.
yeah.
Really nice.